Welcome back to Nourished Inside Out, the space where growth gets real and self love leads the way. I'm your host, Annetta Walklaw, and before we dive into today's episode, I want to remind you of something powerful. You are worthy, you are enough, and you don't need to wait for permission to love yourself fully. That's exactly why I wrote my book, Blooming with Self Love, to give you the tools, affirmations, and daily mindset shifts to help you stand in your power and own your story. This book isn't just words on a page, it's a movement. So if you're ready to stop shrinking and start showing up for yourself, grab your copy today with the link in the show notes below, and let's walk this self love journey together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Nourished Inside Out. Today I'm here with Kristin Louise Duncombe, and she is a therapist, life coach, and a best-selling author, and she specializes in complex trauma and helping women create the lives they dream of. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kristin.
Thank you for having me. I'm just excited to be here with you today.
Absolutely. Do you mind telling us a little bit of your backstory and what had motivated or prompted you to want to become a therapist?
Yes. So let's see. What could I tell you is the backstory? So I think that one of the formative things about, or one of the details that really has to do with what formed me in my life is that I'm what they call a foreign service brat. So my dad was a U.S. diplomat, which means that after being born in Washington, D.C., I basically spent the rest of my childhood moving all around the world. And for anyone who's moved a lot, whether internationally or even just like, I know there's lots of military kids in the USA, people that have to move a lot know that you have to become quickly good at adapting. And adapting is not always easy. So a lot of us struggle with adaptation problems. So I think that for me in my life, moving so frequently and between so many different countries and different languages and interacting and going to school with people from so many different cultures, I learned to be really resilient, to adapt quickly, but to also recognize adaptation difficulties and how to work with them. And that was probably one of my entry points into wanting to become a therapist.
Something that you said is that it required a lot of resilience. What does that mean for you? Because I feel like it can be either an overused word or a really vague word. So, what does resilience mean to you?
Yes, that's such a great point because, like so many words these days, a lot of words are overused or they're incorrectly used. And that makes me crazy. As an avid reader and a writer, when I hear people using words incorrectly, I always want to like clarify and explain. But, you know, sometimes you have to bite your tongue. But resilience in this case, what I'm talking about is the capacity to bounce back and the capacity to get up if you've gotten knocked down by something. So, like, for example, let me give you an example from my own growing up. When I was 14, my family moved from West Africa, where I was in a small international school, to Cairo, Egypt, where I got thrown into a big American high school. And that school in the international school circuit, it's called Cairo American College. And I'm naming it because maybe some of your listeners have even attended it. That's one of the sort of well-known international schools on the international school circuit. And I'm only talking about my experience because I know that for some people that was like a wonderful place to be. For me, coming from a super teeny weeny school where there was like 8 people in my class to this big high school that had all the sort of predictable cliches that you would imagine from a big American high school, like the jocks and the druggies and the cheerleaders. And it was intimidating. But what I was going to say is the night before the first day of school, so I started 9th grade there, a spider walked across my face and left a trail of bites. It must have happened while I was asleep, and it was the doctor that said it was a spider. but I had these inflamed bites all over one side of my face. And I had to start school in this intimidating environment like that. And we were talking about the word resilient. That required resilience because, of course, I did not want to go to school. Of course, my parents forced me to go to school. And being resilient in that case was just getting through, holding my head up and getting through and feeling like people were looking at me. Some people were, there were bullies at the school, and I just had to deal with it.
Yeah, that's an incredible story that you have a very unique background as well because not many people go to international schools, especially in different countries. And the fact that you were not from there, what are some of the challenges that you faced when you were in school? Was it fitting in with friends? Was there a language barrier? What are some challenges that you faced?
Well, the thing is that when you're part of that international expat crowd, you're actually quite protected. It's kind of like a little bubble. And in some ways, it's very elite. And in fact, you're living in a way that is much, is well beyond the level that you'd be living at if you had just stayed in your home country.
Yeah.
So I didn't have to worry about language barriers, things like that, because being in an international school, I was taught in English, and the teachers came also from an international background. The real international aspect of it is that the other students at the school were from all over the world. So it was other kids from similar backgrounds that needed a place to go to school because, like, depending on where you live, when we lived in the Ivory Coast, that was the country in West Africa where we lived. We arrived there when I was 10. The language of that country is French. I didn't speak French when I was 10 years old. So I went to an international school so that I could be instructed in English. The language in Egypt, obviously, is Arabic. I didn't speak Arabic. So I studied Arabic at my international school, but most of the instruction was in English. From Egypt, we moved to New Delhi. Again, I didn't speak Hindi or Urdu. So I was in an international school where we spoke English. So that really wasn't the difficulty. I would say that the difficulties about being in high school were pretty similar to the difficulties that any high schooler has to deal with, and that's dealing with other kids and some of the tensions of, trying to get along in what can sometimes be, high school can be a hostile environment. I didn't have a very good experience at my high school in Cairo, but the high school I went to in New Delhi, it was a great experience. And again, there might be something that has to do with being in a small school. I think the smaller a school is, the easier it's going to be to find, your people and I think that there's just less capacity for kids to gang up on each other if it's a small environment.
That's so
Yeah.
true. It's like you guys have each other's backs. Everybody knows everybody.
Yeah,
So that
exactly.
makes things a lot more smooth.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So,
That's beautiful. Something that you specializes in is complex trauma. Can you
yes.
explain to us what complex trauma is and how it's different than normal trauma?
Yes, absolutely. So, complex trauma, another way to say complex trauma is developmental trauma. And what that really refers to is the type of trauma that takes place. And we can talk more about what those types of traumas are that cause an impact on a person's psychological development. So, complex trauma is usually what arises after a child has undergone ongoing emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, as
Mm.
opposed to an acute trauma, like, for example, a violent crime, a car crash. Imagine the trauma if you're in an avalanche. That's a sudden, acute terrifying experience that will traumatize you and leave you with post-traumatic stress disorder, but it isn't something that's going to necessarily transform your character development. And my specialization in complex trauma actually stems from going back to, speaking of formative things. So when I was a kid living in West Africa, over the course of a little bit longer than 2 years, one of the senior diplomats at the US Embassy, who was a colleague of my father, he sexually abused me and a handful of other girls. And not only that, so there was ongoing sexual abuse at the hands of a very highly esteemed community member. So, like, imagine the most popular guy in the community that everyone loved and looked up to with an important position. So, he also had a powerful role. Not only did he inflict sexual abuse upon me and 6 other girls in the community, but when it was discovered, the State Department, his employer, my father's employer, they protected him. They told our parents, who were incensed and devastated and outraged and horrified. You can imagine. The State Department said that Mr. Mulcahy, that was the name of the abuser, that he had diplomatic immunity because it was a crime committed in a third country. It was outside of the United States. And within the United States, where he was repatriated to, there at the time, this was 1982, there was no federal law against pedophilia, and therefore there was no crime to prosecute. So diplomatic immunity plus no federal law against pedophilia meant that the people in charge in Washington said, so we're just going to be done with this. So he was not fired. He was not prosecuted. And going back to, we were talking about my specialization in complex trauma. So when I trained to become a therapist, one of the things that I was interested in, obviously, is depression and anxiety and, some of the more typical things that people that train as therapists invariably end up working in, eating disorders. Why? Well, because I had dealt with a lot of these things in my own life. It took me many years to understand that the origin of my own mental health struggles had to do with the developmental wound that I was living with. And that is the fact that, between the ages of 10 and 12, I was sexually abused on an ongoing basis by this middle-aged man. And then when the truth was revealed, I was told, well, you and the other girls, you're not important. He's important. You kids are not important. And all of that really, in a variety of ways, affected my self-image. And so speaking about complex trauma, what I can tell you is that I moved into adolescence and then young adulthood with this idea about myself that I wasn't important and that my only value really was in being an object of desire for men. And well, there's a lot more to say about that, but that's a good example of when I talk about a developmental wound, because maybe another kid who grows up without that type of problem, maybe they don't arrive at age 18 and think the only thing that's important about me is if guys like me. I mean, I think that's something that happens to a lot of young women, even if they haven't been sexually abused, because we live in a culture that constantly objectifies girls and women. And I think that also has an impact. But I think then if you've actually been abused, it just concretizes that message.
Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that. It's so powerful to see how you have taken true, like your true pain, and you've used it for your purpose.
Yes.
So how was it growing up? Like you said that as you got into your early adulthood, you felt like you weren't worthy. How did that affect your relationships as you were get growing up?
Well, I mean, it's so interesting because especially when I look back, gosh, and I was one of those young people at the time. I would get criticized by, my teachers or even my parents, you're boy crazy and all you care about is boys. But the thing is, it's not that I was boy crazy, it's that so none of this was conscious. This is the thing. These were all unconscious reactions that I was having. But as
Yeah.
a teenager and as a young woman moving through the world, as guys would come at me and come on to me, as we know men will do to girls and women, I I didn't know how to say no. So I would get chosen. And so when I say that I didn't feel important, I don't mean that I sat there going, "Oh gee, I don't feel important." That's sort of an after the fact reflection. But what I can tell you how I did feel is that when a guy would express interest in me and choose me, I thought that I had only one option, and that is to be compliant. I literally, and I feel like it sounds crazy, and people, if they hear me say this now, because now, and I know we'll end up talking about this, I'm a very independent person, and you can't just pluck me off the tree the way you used to be able to, the way you could just pluck a mango off the tree. That's how easy it used to be with me, because what I had been indoctrinated in through the abuse of this middle aged man that used to help himself to my body all the time was that when someone wants you, your job is to be accessible. Your job is to be accommodating. Your job is to keep the peace and not make problems. And by saying no is not even part of your vocabulary. And so when I say, to kind of say it quickly, oh, I felt like I wasn't important. What I mean by that is that, a girl who's moving through the world getting solicited by men and feeling like she has to keep going along with things, that comes from a place of not believing that she is allowed to have a limit and a boundary. I had no boundaries at all. None. And yeah.
No, I'm really grateful that you brought that up because it all starts with us sharing our story to realize that we're not the only ones that ever felt like that. Because I felt like that in my last relationship, that I always had to walk on eggshells and keep the peace, and I always had to be the one that would be there no matter what and for anything and everything that my ex would want. And same thing with you. Like, I had no boundaries until it completely just like I ran myself dry and I was shattered into like so many
Yes.
pieces. So
And see,
that's
that's the
so
thing.
true.
Because we're talking about that in the context of complex trauma, but going back to just the wider picture of how us women are enculturated, girls are taught to be pleasers. And and we grow up learning that what makes us valuable is, be a nice girl, be a good girl, do as you're told. And I am not advocating for, the end of manners and the end of cordiality, but I am advocating for teaching girls and anyone else who is vulnerable that it's not about who chooses you, it's about what you choose for yourself. And that is a major switch, because I think what you're actually, have you been following the trial of Sean Combs and the what's his name, the singer who's now, he was filmed beating his girlfriend up in the hallway of that hotel. And now there's this big trial going on. And what the defense attorneys have been arguing is that she was complicit in all these abusive sexual acts that he made her do with male prostitutes, etc. Because if you look at their text exchanges, she said so many things like, "Oh yes, I can't wait for tonight," etc. But what she argues is, I was doing that to keep the peace.
Yeah.
I was doing that because he was paying for my rent. And he is actually my boss, my record contract. Her name is Cassie, but my record contract is managed by him. And I was afraid that if I said no to him, that would be the end of my career. So, I mean, that's a higher scale because it's about financial stuff, but it's the same thing that we're talking about. It's about feeling too afraid to say no to someone because you may get in trouble in some way for it.
Absolutely. I've felt like that so many times as well. For example, like it's just like the little things like you want to keep the peace because you also don't know how that person can react. And that can be a scary place as well. I think unhealthy or abusive relationships can be complex as well because you don't know how that person is going to react when you start stepping into your power and you start setting boundaries. Like I remember when I said, "Hey, like, can we put a boundary or talk about this situation?" Immediately it backfired and told me I was disrespectful. So
Yes.
I agree. Yeah.
And so then when he said that to you, did you back down?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, see, there's a name for that. That thing that we're talking about, that dynamic of accommodating and pleasing and trying to keep the peace, that's called fawning. So,
Mm.
fawning is one of the reactions that develops in the face of complex trauma. And we fawn because even though it's against our best interests in the moment, it's actually a very adaptive way to try to ensure safety.
Yeah.
So it's a strategy that, on the one hand is what we use to survive in abusive emotional situations, but on the other hand it keeps us trapped. So it's very complicated.
Absolutely. What were some critical elements for you to recover from complex childhood trauma?
Well, gosh, I mean, it's really interesting because, I'm 55. I'm going to turn 56 in August, and I can tell you that I don't really feel like I started really recovering from complex trauma until I was 46 years old. And what happened when I was 46 years old is I left my marriage. And the reason I sort of highlight that moment as a turning point is because I was married for 20 years. And even though there was plenty of good things that took place in my marriage, and I have a good relationship with my ex-husband and two wonderful children, I, when I agreed to get married, I was fawning. You see, because as I mentioned, I've got an American passport. Both of my parents are American. So culturally, I am American, but I grew up overseas. And when I was a young woman in graduate school in New Orleans, Louisiana, I met this man who was older than me, who was not a US citizen, even though he was in the United States for graduate school. He was an Argentinian doctor, and we fell madly in love. But the only problem is that he hated / still hates the United States. He has a major anti-American sentiment. And he's allowed, I mean, I think there's plenty of problematic things about the United States of America. I'm not going to start, going USA, USA. It's not about that. But as you know, you can't help where you're from. And so he told me very early on in our relationship that if I wanted to have a relationship with him, I had to agree to leave the United States and never live there again. And the thing is, it's not what I wanted at the time. As it turns out, that is how my life has evolved. Like right now, I live in Paris, France, and this is now my permanent home. And I'm happy with that. I am not saying like, oh, poor me, I have to live in Paris. I mean, I do think I'm super lucky. But the thing is, when I was 26 years old, and that's when I met him and agreed to those terms, I agreed to those terms because I was too afraid to say no. Not because he was beating me or anything like that. It was just because I knew he would leave me if I insisted. Because at that time, what I wanted for myself was to create a life in the United States. I had only been back in the States for a few years because, as I've mentioned many times now, I spent my childhood outside of the United States. And so being in school and training to be a therapist in New Orleans, my vision was to set up life in the States and have a life near to my family. Instead, I agreed to give up that plan to accommodate him. And off we went on our life together. And like I said, we did create an interesting life together that did have plenty of good things in it. But there was a lot of limitations based on his anti-Americanism, and that affected me greatly. I mean, it's difficult to be involved with someone who hates your culture. And it would come up repeatedly in different ways. And so you had asked, like, how did I finally recover from complex trauma? So, I mean, there's lots of little things that happened along the way, but I can say the two main pivot points were when one day, there was no plan here. If you had asked me the day before if I was going to end my marriage, I would have said, no, of course not. It happened very spontaneously, but we had another sort of infraction that had something to do with him hating the United States. And I said, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I want to separate. That was the first step. And we did separate. But then after I got out of my marriage, for the first year, I was just sort of paralyzed and trying to figure out like, oh my God, what am I going to do? But then when I started dating again, when I went into marriage, internet was barely a thing. When I went in at 26, and when I came out 20 years later, we were in full internet land with Tinder, Bumble, all of that stuff. So next thing you know, I'm getting onto online dating and I start meeting all these guys. And instantly, at the ripe age of 47, 48, when I really started dating, all of a sudden I was making all the same mistakes that I had made when I was a younger woman. I was doing all of that exact same stuff. I was getting chosen and then going along with it because I felt like, oh, well, if you like me, then I should please you. I can't bear to disappoint you. I can't, you're sending me all these flattering messages, and how can I disappoint you? My job is to be as wonderful as you keep telling me you think I am, even though you don't even know me. And you can imagine. So what ended up happening? I got involved with all sorts of guys that were not good for me. Some of them were just like terrible jerks. Some of them, it just wasn't the right match. But it took me like a couple of years to start realizing that I was stuck in this mentality of being a kid who felt like she couldn't say no. Yeah, I was working with a therapist at that time who asked me a lot, like, why do you feel like you have to appease people? Like, why do you feel when you don't even like someone that you have to give them a second date? Why do you feel that you have to kiss someone goodnight even when you find them unappealing? And I just kept saying, well, because I don't want to disappoint them. And she'd say, why? What do you want? And that was when I really started realizing, like, oh my God, you are so stuck. You're so stuck in that mentality of compliance.
Yeah. How did you break free from those limiting beliefs of what you once believed about dating and relationships? And then when you left your marriage, you got back into the dating pool and you realized you were doing the same habits as your old self would. How did you break free from those limiting beliefs?
Well, you know what? How I did it was step by step. And what I mean by that is, because we're talking about this now after the fact when it's all kind of neatly packaged. But while I was in it, it was literally um, making mistakes, but having self-awareness about it. Like it was very, very useful to be in therapy at that time. Well, I'm still in therapy, but I've moved. So when all of this was happening, I was living in Switzerland. That's the last place I lived with my husband. We were in Switzerland. And then I've since moved back to France. But I worked with a psychoanalyst. She was my therapist, and I had weekly sessions with her. And I would go in with this material, like I'm sure she thought our sessions were just like completely kooky because you know it's that duality that you live with. I mean, I'm otherwise a smart, successful person, and I had a successful therapy practice myself. I'm an author. I'm a mom. It's not like I have a totally dysfunctional life. Everything was very functional, with the exception of this one part of my life, me interfacing with men. Men where there would be, I don't mean like any guy like at the grocery store, but I mean someone that there was the potential for a romantic or sexual connection with. And so I say step by step because I would go into therapy on a weekly basis and be like, okay, this is what happened this week. And she would question me and I would defend my actions. But bit by bit, she started helping me realize that I was stuck in the mentality of a 10-year-old girl who thought that
Mm,
she had to do what the adults say. It's like I had assigned the role of adult to men, and myself I was seeing as a child. And I started practicing, in little baby steps, saying no and taking back my no, learning to say no in big and small ways. No to, I don't want to go see the Star Wars movie, to no, I don't want to spend the night with you. And then the big one, no, I don't want to have a second date. Or the
mm,
biggest one, no, I don't want to have a date at all after, because you know how it is on online dating. Well, I'm making an assumption there, but I think in this day and age, most people have tried online dating. It can be so toxic. You get online and instantly you start getting some, or at least I would, some really dumb messages, like with people instantly going to sexual stuff. And the former version of me didn't have the instinct or the capacity that if someone sent me some stupid sexy message when we hadn't even said hello yet, I wouldn't block them. I'd be like, oh, I mean, I don't want to say I'm ashamed. I'm not ashamed. I'm done being ashamed with that, but it's embarrassing when I think back of just how incredibly um vulnerable I was. I mean, I feel a lot of compassion for that I want to say that young woman, but I wasn't even that young. But it's like I had been married all those years. And when I came out of marriage, it's like I was still just that 26-year-old who had a lot of unhealed trauma going back to age 10 when all the sexual abuse started.
completely. And it's totally valid how you felt and what you were doing because if all you know is all you know, then you're not gonna change. Like if nothing changes, nothing changes. We've all heard
Exactly.
that,
Yeah.
but we all need to go on our own journey. Like I
Yeah.
was a people pleaser. I didn't have boundaries. I never heard the word boundaries until I was 23 years old. And that was when I was leaving my ex-husband and filing for divorce. And I had come across a friend as I was traveling, and he's like, Bro, you need boundaries. I went to Google and I Googled what boundaries mean.
Boundary.
I said I had no idea.
Yeah.
I literally Googled it like the week before. I was like, hey, can we put a boundary? And he's like, you're so disrespectful. And then I forgot about it. So I had to Google it again.
Yeah. Yeah. And isn't that amazing that something that to us now seems so self-evident, it
Yeah.
wasn't at a certain moment? It sounds like for you as well, it was the least evident thing. I mean, I can tell you categorically for myself, I thought that I did not, it's not even that I didn't deserve boundaries, it's that I thought that the only thing that made me valuable to other people was pleasing them. And so the prospect of not pleasing them was terrifying. I felt like I would be loveless. And speaking of pivot points, that's something that I think is really, really interesting. That one of the biggest things that has changed for me in the last 10 years is that I don't I don't worry about that anymore. I don't, it's not, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying who cares about love. I do believe that love makes the world go round. But what I mean when I say that is the love between friends, the love that you have for your children or your siblings or your parents, or if you are lucky enough to have a good romantic connection, yes, but I no longer believe that romance is the most important thing. That's another thing I think girls get indoctrinated to believe, that the most important thing is to find a great guy. I mean, at least that's what I grew up hearing. And I don't believe that any longer. So I'm not afraid anymore to say no to men because I just don't care. I'm happy. And if one day I do have a man in my life again, that will be great. But if I don't feel that my life is unimportant because I feel that I'm important just in my own presence. Do you know what I mean?
You don't feel dependent. You want somebody, but you don't need somebody. And I think
Exactly.
that's a big distinction factor is, it's so interesting because after I left my ex-husband, I would like make some friends along the way. And even if they were girlfriends, like I had this one roommate, she would always say, Anetta, you haven't gone on a date in a long time. Do you want me to set you up with somebody? And I'm like, no, like I'm happy and content by myself. Like,
Yeah.
if I want to be with somebody, it's because I want to, not because I need to.
Right.
And that's a really big different factor.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
What
and
piece
I
of advice, sorry, what piece of advice would you give to somebody who is struggling with their self-worth or setting boundaries in relationships and really understanding that they don't need somebody, but they would want?
Well, and that's exactly what I was just going to say. It's so interesting because I find that the conversation, or one of the conversations that I have so regularly with both clients and with friends, um, namely women friends, because I don't know. I mean, certainly some men have this problem as well, but I have more women in my life, so I don't feel that I can really speak to like what the average guy goes through. But I feel like I'm constantly talking to women about developing that muscle, that emotional muscle within that allows you to enjoy your own company, because I think that is part of the thing that gets us into trouble. When if you are terrified to spend any time by yourself, then that means you have to constantly be looking for someone to accompany you whether a wrongly matched romantic partner or just hanging out with friends that maybe you don't totally enjoy. In French, there's an expression that it's better to be alone than poorly accompanied. And I love that expression. There's also an expression which is hell is others, and I love that too. But I'm saying that a little bit more tongue in cheek. But I firmly advocate for only spend time with people that you really enjoy. And if people that you really enjoy are not available on a given day, go out and enjoy the person that you should be married to, and that's yourself. Go to the movies on your own. Go out for lunch or dinner or coffee by yourself. Take a good book. Take a walk. Don't be afraid to create the life that you want, even if someone isn't around to accompany you. But whatever you do, don't fill your time up with people that you don't really want to spend time with, because that is just so exhausting. And so I feel like I'm constantly having that conversation, because that is not something that is easy for a lot of people.
I love that. Thank you. And I also wanted to ask you, you wrote a book, so can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yes, thank you so much. I've actually written 3 books, but the book that I would like to talk about today is my most recent book, because it has everything to do with what we are talking about today. So this book, I've got it right here, is called Object. And so it's a memoir, and what object refers to is this thing that I was saying, that I, as a result of the sexual abuse and then the way the State Department protected the abuser, is that I moved into adolescence and adulthood seeing myself as an object of desire for men, seeing myself as an object as opposed to seeing myself as the subject of my own life. And so this book, Object, is about the abuse. It's about what happened. It's about the US government cover up. It's about how the abuser finally did go to jail 20 years later when he was arrested for raping an 8-year-old girl. But the book is also about moving out of objectification into seeing myself as the subject of my own life. So it's about those years post-marriage and all those crazy dating experiences I had, and how I learned to say no and to have a boundary. Something that I love about this book is that, so for me, the title was always Object. But some people, when the book first came out, it came out in August of 2024, some people wrote to me and were like, oh my God, that's such a great title, Object. I object. And I was like, no, it's not I object. It's Object, but it's such a great play on words. That was unintentional. I didn't do that on purpose. And in fact, it hadn't even occurred to me, but I know now that some people think that the book says I object to objectification, which is also true. I do object to objectification. But yeah, so that I hope anyone that's listening to this podcast that is struggling with feeling like an object, please get in touch. And if finances are a problem, I will send you a copy of the book, because my mission is to share the story of how the US government protected a serial pedophile, because I'm really angry about it, when he was finally arrested, more than 20 years after the abuse of me ended. There was so many victims that came out of the woodwork. By protecting him, they paved the road for him to continue abusing and raping young girls for 22 years. And I'm just so sick of rape culture. I'm so sick of it. And so I'm really on a mission to to share that story, but I'm also on a mission. I yearn to help girls and women feel like they can be the subjects of their own lives and not the objects of men's lives.
It's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing all of that. Kristen, it's been such a pleasure and honor to have you on today. Can you
Thank
tell us, yes, can you tell us where can people stay in touch with you and support you in your work?
Probably the easiest thing, as usual in this age of Google that we live in and internet is to just Google me. And there you'll find, if you Google Kristin Duncombe or Kristin Louise Duncombe, you will either come to my Instagram where I post tons of pictures that come from the years that this book covers. You can find my author page. You can find my website, KristinDuncombe.com. And if you go to my website, you can read about my books, my therapy and coaching practice. You can also find my email there if you want to write. So yeah, I'm easily Googleable. You can find me on Google.
And then what does it mean for you to be nourished inside out?
For me, being nourished inside out really goes back to that thing that we've been talking about today about feeling solid and content in my own company and taking joy and pleasure in the things that genuinely bring me happiness and that don't require the presence of another. So that is reading books. I'm an avid reader and I love to listen to books as well. I love to take long walks and listen to good books, good music. I don't know if you can see behind me, but I'm a big plant mama. My apartment is filled with plants, so I love taking care of my flowers and my plants. I have 2 cats. I, contrary to what I was saying about not having, other people, I am super close to my 2 children. And so having a good relationship with my children is also something that brings me great happiness. But yeah, it's just to have a life that is simple, healthy, and I'm not dependent on the approval of others, but particularly men.
Absolutely. I love all of that. Well, I will have all of the links linked down in the show notes below so people can stay in touch. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure speaking to you.